And we're live. What's up, y'all? Welcome back to another Fish the Moment live stream. Tonight, Randy and I are going to be tackling an awesome topic. We're going to explain how you guys can catch more 4-pound plus bass every time you go to the lake. Now, we're not going to guarantee you're going to catch them every single trip, but we're going to explain how you can catch more or have more days where you catch a 4-pounder than not, some of the baits, conditions, techniques that we use to get the job done. And the reason we're going to do this video is because we were actually out yesterday on Table Rock Lake and we were throwing big baits. We're not going to spoil the video because we're going to be posting that in a couple weeks, but we basically caught some really good fish on a big bait, but neither of us had a fish in the boat until 1:50 in the afternoon, and we've been fishing for 6 hours, and then the feeding window kicked in and we caught a bunch of big fish. We're going to talk about how that all works today during the stream, how you can choose when to commit to a big bait to catch big fish, and maybe when you shouldn't, and hopefully help you put a lot more big fish in the boat this year. So Randy, how's it going tonight?
It's been good, Johnny, man. Just actually tired of this rain here, man. It has been raining here in Missouri for like 3 weeks in a row. It's just been unbelievable. Raining right now even. But, man, I'm really excited about this live stream tonight because I'm fascinated by big baits. I mean, Oliver Nye is one of the Megabass pro staffers that, that I share with Megabass. And he's like the premier big bass, big bait expert in the world, probably, in my opinion. And I've had a chance to talk to Oliver about the baits. I'm fascinated by them. And we got a lot to talk about because this is a bait category that's it's definitely a high risk, high reward type of situation. And there's some keys to being successful with it. So we'll dig into that big time tonight.
For sure. And when we're talking about ways to catch bigger fish, guys, usually there's two ways to go about that. Either you get really good at finding areas with big fish, which is not always easy to do. I can sometimes do it with my electronics, and I can use settings and stuff like that. Or it's using a big bait and basically figuring out where those bigger fish are throughout the day by using a big bait to call those fish in. Would you agree with that, Randy?
Yeah, the thing about big baits, guys, especially in cleaner water situations, even though they may not be the best bait under a lot of conditions to actually catch the bass, they're indicator baits because they can show you what's in an area. And sometimes you can follow up with different baits and catch them. But that's one of the things that Oliver told me. He goes, he uses those big baits actually to see how many big fish are in an area. And that's one of the things these things do. They will pull out the biggest fish in the area just to look at them, if nothing else.
For sure. Now, let me kind of just run you through a few of the big baits for our audio listeners. I'll tell you the names, the bait, the size, but if you're here on the live stream live, you'll be able to see me holding them up. And before we do that real quick, I want to say hi to everyone who's joining live on the stream. We got Darren, Mike, Timo, Dustin, Basquatch, Ernest, James. Let's see here. Jack, Matt, Mike. Got a ton of guys on. 100 people on. I can't say hi to everyone, but we got a lot of people on. Excited to see you guys on the stream tonight. Let us know if you have any questions as we're going through, and we'll try to answer them. So basically, when I'm talking to big bait, guys, I'm talking about baits like this. Now, you might not think that you can't really tell how big that is. Here is a Megabass Vision 110 Plus 1. And this is an 8-inch Ben Parker Magnum Flutter spoon. An absolutely massive bait compared to that little tiny 110 centimeter Vision 110. Now, that's still not a small bait. That's a 4-inch bait. But compared to that Magnum Flutter spoon, absolutely tiny. Strike King 10XD. Maybe lengthwise it's about the same, but the body is very big, very thick. Going to get you a lot of big bites. Big swim baits, 7 and 8-inch swim baits you can throw offshore. These are the types of baits we're talking about, guys. And when you're throwing these big baits, the number one thing you have to realize is that you need to commit to fishing these baits if you're going to get bit. Regardless of whether it's a big flutter spoon, a big swim bait up shallow, glide baits, anything like that. You're not going to go out and get 50 bites a day. I don't think I've ever gone out, Randy, with a bait this big, a 6+ inch bait and caught 15, 20 fish. It's usually a 3 to 7 bites a day deal. Is that what you found too?
Oh yeah, I mean, and a lot of times, depending upon the bait, it's a 0 to 1 or 2 bites, per day on there because, guys, that's one of the things that you have to stress. We'll get into later. It's like the biggest thing that you have to do initially when you get into this is you have to have a major shift in your mentality and your expectations on the water, because it's an entirely different ball game. So there's, we'll get into the tournament part of it and the recreational part of it, but there's about three key elements that you have to do basically from a mental perspective in order to prepare yourself for a day on the water. Because it's if you've never done it before, if you've never thrown one of these giant baits like this Megabass iSlide 262 glide bait, which is a 6-7 ounce bait, it's quite an experience for chunking that thing all day long.
Yeah, and just to kind of give you guys a little teaser, I'm going to pull up a lake here and just kind of give you some context of what we mean by taking a lot of time to catch fish. We're just going to roll over here to Table Rock Lake. I'm not going to talk about too much what was going on, but I'm just going to give you guys a general idea of what was happening. Basically, we came out here to throw a big bait. And I'm not even talking about what the bait is. You guys will probably see some content rolling through here. But we were throwing a big bait, and we were both throwing it. We had to throw it all day. Now, when we're throwing baits that are 6 or 7 inches long in general, there's a couple of things you have to know. One, usually those bass are going to be able to get a very good look at that bait. So if you go to a lake like Table Rock here that has 6 to 8 feet of water visibility sometimes near the lowest part of the lake, if you don't have any wind or clouds or current, those fish are going to be able to see that bait very well. And because it's such a big bait, they're going to get a great look at it, and they're probably going to realize it's not natural, or they're going to be a little bit wary of it. So when we got to Table Rock Lake yesterday, we had the worst possible conditions for big bait fishing ever. We had bluebird skies, sunny skies, no wind. That is absolutely worst case scenario. And it rained like every single day for like 2 weeks. And then, of course, the day Randy and I go, it was perfect conditions, or not perfect, but it was sunny, bluebird skies, no wind, no rain, no wind in sight, even though I've been doing that for 2 weeks straight. So what happened is that Randy and I kind of messed around. We ran all over the lake. I ran into some of the dirtier water as well as Randy. I ran in the back of Long Creek here. Randy ran way up the James River to get in some dirtier water. And we were throwing a big bait. And for whatever reason, regardless of whether we were in the dirty water, the clear water, we could not get bit. Now, I actually did find a few fish, and I actually was getting my big bait deeper. And I was getting it down there in 25, 30 feet of water. The problem on Table Rock was that there are a lot of spotted bass offshore right now. There's not a lot of largemouth offshore. So I would actually get a ton of spotted bass to hit my bait, and actually put a trailer hook on the back, a teaser hook, and had 2 big spotted bass, 2.5 pound spotted bass jump off. And because you're throwing such a big bait, those fish can leverage themselves and throw the bait very easily. So because those spotted bass have too small of a mouth, I wasn't able to get any of those fish in the boat. So I was struggling to get fish in the boat there. And then Randy, you were struggling up shallow because those fish were following your bait. Can you kind of talk about that, what was happening in your areas?
Well, that's the thing about it on a lake that any type of a major lake where you get a lot of pressure, not only did we have conditions that were not conducive to big baits, but we also came off a weekend where Table Rock got hammered by tournaments. I mean, there were hundreds and hundreds of boats Saturday and Sunday just beating the water to a froth, plus the recreational people. And I could see it. When I was fishing that big bait, before these fish started eating it, they started eating it in the afternoon, like Johnny said earlier. But the first part of the day, I was getting just as many bites on the thing, but they were coming up and just nipping it. I could see them coming up and follow it. I'd see them follow it out of the shallow cover that I was fishing. And it didn't make any difference. I changed some colors different up. I changed retrieves a little bit. And it was just the personality of the fish. And that's one of the things that you have to realize, guys, is when you're fishing these big baits, and when we're talking big baits, we're talking anywhere between like a 6-inch bait to a 12-inch bait. I've got several laid out here. We'll show you in here a little bit. But when you're fishing a bait like that, the fish have to be just in the right personality to eat that bait, because it's a huge commitment for even a 3 or 4 pound bass to take on a bait that's 8 or 10 inches long. So those fish have to be just in the right personality, just in the right mood. And that's what makes the bite window on a big bait so critical. And, I've had talks with Oliver and I about this. I've had talks with Chris Aldane about it. A lot of the guys at Byron Velhook, a lot of these guys that fish big swim baits, and all of them say the same thing. It's like there's the reason most people don't catch a lot of fish on big baits is they don't commit to it. And they'll go out and they'll throw it for an hour and put it down. But somebody like Zaldane, he'll never put it down. So when there's that bite window that Jonny and I experienced, we experienced a 2-hour bite window in Table Rock. Most people would have given up on it long before that, but we forced ourselves with this challenge to stay with it. And we capitalized on that bite window. It happened between 2 to 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And just like Zaldane tells me all the time, that bite window is usually sometimes up in the middle of the day. It's usually not early and late in the day, which sort of goes against the common grain. Most people would think low light conditions are the time that you want to fish those big moving baits. That's not true. For whatever reason, those fish get hot, they get fired up, and they'll actually attack that bait by the head, during those midday bite windows.
Yeah, and it was crazy, Randy, with that bite window, because we actually were talking about it, and I was fishing down here more towards a dam. You were kind of in this mid-lake section, but in both situations, neither of us had a fish in the boat until like 1:45, and then at 1:45 till 4:30, we caught all of our fish that day, and we were getting bit like constantly on this bait, and literally we could not buy a bite. I was getting to the point, Randy, where I was like, we're going to have to cash in this video. Neither of us were going to catch him. What's going on? Like, we were texting back and forth, like, have you caught a fish? And then we're like, no. But because we did this challenge, we forced ourselves to throw it all day long. And again, like Randy said, basically what happened is it went from having bluebird skies, no wind, to cloud cover rolled in, some wind started blowing a little bit, and I know for Randy, it wasn't even that windy. For me, what happened is that on the lower end of the lake, there was so much boat traffic that the boat traffic created these like wakes, basically, like actually simulated wind, and then the cloud cover in that front activated those fish, and they stopped missing the bait, they stopped slapping it, and they just started choking it. And the other thing is I started transitioning from fishing offshore to going up shallow. Because when I was fishing up, when I know from big bait fishing, especially shallow water big baits, it's really tough to get those fish to commit on those bluebird sky, no wind days. And Randy, that's exactly what you experienced. You basically were trying to force that shallow bite all day, and they just weren't committing. But what I did is I was trying to kind of adjust for that by going offshore. And there weren't any schools of big largemouth offshore. I graphed for like 4 hours, and there were no big largemouth that had pulled offshore yet because the lake was still high and stuff. There were spotted bass offshore, but again, those fish the spotted bass, even the 2.5 pounders, couldn't get the bait in their mouth. So I had to force myself to go up shallow, and once I saw that cloud cover roll in, the wind started blowing, I'm like, I can get him to bite that bait up shallow. The problem I had was that I hadn't been doing that all day, so you had already found where the fish were, so I had to catch up because you were missing fish all morning. I had to try to figure out where they were, and I was kind of behind the 8 ball then. And what that kind of shows is I was almost not committing in the way that you committed. You basically stayed in that shallow water where you knew those fish were living, and you were having them follow it all day long. You were seeing 3 and 4 pounders following your bait. Once the conditions rolled in, you were able to go to those areas where you knew those fish were in and catch them, versus I still capitalized on the bite window, but I had to find them a lot faster, and I was kind of running out of water because I didn't know exactly where to look. So that's one thing that I found out even just yesterday is sometimes when you're throwing a big bait, not getting bit is just as important sometimes as getting bit, because like Randy said, those big fish will show themselves. You'll get thumped by them on that big bait, and if they're hitting that big bait at some point throughout the day and you know they're big enough fish, 3 and 4 pounders, actually eat it, once that feeding window comes in, you're just going to absolutely crush them. So that was really, really cool.
Yeah, good question from Darren Clemens here. Yes, what do you guys attribute the bite window to? And for me, this is what it is. It's like, you guys, everybody on this feed has fished a lot, and you understand basically light intensity. And you know what I'm talking about? It's like when you get out there, like, early in the morning, 6, 7, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock in the morning, there's a certain look and there's a certain light intensity, the way that the sun hits the water. And then when you're talking about the midday, there's also a different, light intensity that hits the water. And the same with the afternoon. Now, what's happened, and I know you guys have seen this, at the brightest part of the day, a lot of times, the way that the sun hits the water, to me, it just doesn't look that fishy. But what you have is when you get later in the afternoon and the sun goes down at a different angle, the sun hits that water, even if it's behind a cloud at a different angle, and the light intensity is just different. I think personally the bite window on those big swim baits is created by various light intensities. And how the bass react to those light intensities has a lot to do with the water clarity you're fishing, how deep the fish are. I mean, if you're fishing a swim bait, or a big bait like Jonny was deep, that light intensity is going to be completely different than when you're fishing it up shallow like I was. So there's a lot of different combinations there, but that time of the day and the light intensity, sun angle mixed with those variables of water clarity and water depth, to me, is what creates that window. And you sort of feel it. What happens when you get out, when you fish a long time, guys, when you've been out in the water, you sort of feel like you sort of know, and you get this feeling intuitively when these fish are going to start biting. Everything just sort of feels right. The humidity in the air is different. Like I said, the light intensities are right. And when all that stuff comes together, if you guys fish very much at all, you know what I'm talking about. You just sort of feeling it. Just feels like you're getting ready to catch them. And that's sort of the way it was, with us yesterday on there when everything got right with it.
For sure. And those bite windows, guys, they are it's usually going to be dictated a lot of times by a condition change. It doesn't necessarily need to be that it goes from being cloudy to sunny. It could be that it goes from cloudy and then the wind picks up. Or maybe it was windy, but then picks up to a 15-mile-an-hour wind from a 5-mile-an-hour wind. Or maybe the wind shifts directions. There's little things that can change that bite window. And really what we're talking about is the fact that if you don't commit all day to these baits, you're going to miss that window. It was crazy because I went all day not getting a bite, and then within 45 minutes I had 5 keeper bites from 2.5 to 4 pound bass in 45 minutes. 5 keeper bites. It was like the easiest thing in the world to go catch a fish, and for 6 hours I thought there were no fish left in Table Rock Lake, at least up shallow. So that's kind of the deal that you'll find. So yeah, is that what you find, Randy?
Oh, definitely so. And, another thing about big baits, guys, what you're going to find out is that, in my experience, I think a lot of the bass, in fact, I think even more than not, I think they hit these baits with their mouth shut. And I think that's why you have so many that miss it, that hit it, and you don't hook them, or you're reeling along there and you'll feel them just jolted or jar it. I'm absolutely convinced that they hit it with their mouth shut a lot of times. And I don't really know why that is. I mean, it has to do with the fact that bass are not stupid. They're very wary. I mean, they haven't been here for as long as they have by being stupid. They can't afford to make a mistake because they're going to get, they're going to get cold out of the food chain if they make a mistake too many times. So they've evolved over the years to just, be very wary, very keen. And, I think that's why they hit them with their mouth shut a lot of the times.
For sure. Now, let's kind of get into a little bit about specific baits and some techniques here, Randy, because I think that's what a lot of guys are waiting to hear about, is not just the generalities, but the specifics. So let me start with that big flutter spoon, because guys seem very interested in that, and I have some graphics to share with you guys. Hopefully you guys will enjoy that. But basically, this is that big flutter spoon I showed earlier. It's an 8-inch Ben Parker Magnum flutter spoon. And you're probably like, what is going to eat this 8-inch flutter spoon? I mean, compared to a 4-inch Megabass Vision 110 plus 1, that's a giant bait. What you have to realize, guys, is that when fish are biting this bait, there's 2 things that's going through their head. One, they are keying in on a very specific type of forage, and in this case, it's gizzard shad. So whenever I'm throwing a big Magnum flutter spoon offshore, I need a lake that has big gizzard shad in it. 7, 8, 9-inch gizzard shad. You're not going to be able to go on a lake where the primary forage is 2 to 3-inch threadfin shad and catch a bunch of big fish on the flutter spoon. You need to have bait fish in your lake that are the size of this spoon. So that's one thing a lot of guys mess up when they try to throw these big baits, is they don't understand the need to throw this bait in lakes that have the forage necessary. Now, another thing that you might realize is when you're throwing a bait like this, like I have another spoon here that works really well. This is a 6-inch 6.5-inch mini Magnum flutter spoon versus an 8-inch. The 6-inch, 6.5-inch is kind of my go-to size that works really, really well and catches some good fish. The problem with this bait here is that it's similar to the average size of a lot of these big gizzard shad, where this 8-inch flutter spoon is the size of the biggest gizzard shad. And some of these really big bass, they don't necessarily want to waste or exert a lot of energy in certain times of the year. And the times I throw and catch fish on this bait the most, it's going to be basically the late post spawn, 70-degree water temperatures, all the way until those water temperatures hit 70 degrees again in the fall. So it's kind of a late post spawn to late fall technique. It's really good in the late fall. It can be good all summer long. And what I'm trying to do, guys, is I'm trying to trigger the biggest, baddest fish in that school of fish to actually eat my bait. And a lot of times what you'll find is that if you are fishing later in the year, there are a lot of schools of fish that are pressured by anglers in community holes. So let me kind of share my screen. I'll show you what I'm talking about with some of these schools of fish, because I think this will kind of help make a little more sense. So let me show you a school of fish. This is a school of fish right here, guys. There's a big brush pile over here that sometimes fish would set up in, but over here you have a grouping of fish that is anywhere from 15 to 20 bass large. And whenever I'm catching fish on this big floater spoon, I'm usually finding bigger schools of fish. I'm not going to be catching them on isolated 1 or 2 schools of fish or like 3 fish on a school. You need at least 7 to 10 bass in that school. Now, a lot of times that big floater spoon will work on schools that are even bigger than that, 40, 50 fish. But usually I get a lot of good bites on the floater spoon with those groups of 7 to 10 bass. That seems to be kind of the sweet spot for me that I see on the graph. And so what you'll find is you'll find these suspended schools of fish, and these schools might be pressured by a ton of other anglers throwing standard baits. A little hair jig, I say little, it's like 4 or 5 inch hair jig, a regular swim bait, 5-inch paddle tail swim bait, deep diving crank baits, a 5-inch flutter spoon. And when these fish get pressured by those other baits, they get used to that size lure, and those bigger fish will completely ignore that bait. What also happens is that all the smaller fish will start to ignore it as well. What happens, though, is that when you come in with a bigger flutter spoon, this 8-inch flutter spoon, you're imitating a bait that's bigger than anything those fish have seen, and your goal is to get one of those big fish to fire, just one of them. If one of those big fish can fire on this bait, usually it's going to be a 4 to 7 pound bass. And then also, when that one big bass starts to fire, all those other fish will start to fire, and you can catch a lot of good fish after that on a smaller bait. I might, if I catch a giant fish on the 8-inch flutter spoon, I might quickly go back to the 6-inch flutter spoon. The reason for that is because this big flutter spoon, this 8-inch, basically has the exact same size hook. This is the biggest hook you can basically get manufactured on that spoon, and basically the hook size is the same on both these spoons, but you have like another ounce of lead and another 2 inches basically to deal with to give those fish leverage to throw this bait. And fish will throw this bait like it's nothing. You have like a 50% landing ratio, but if you can get them in the boat, you can then go back to the little bit smaller spoon, and you can then start catching them on that. You can start catching them on a variety of other baits as well. So I find that when those fish are really keyed in on those big gizzard shad and they're inactive, you can't get them to bite other baits, you can throw that big flutter spoon to trigger them into biting. And those fish can be inactive. I can catch these fish in the middle of the day, no wind, no cloud cover, anything like that, and still get those fish to bite. It usually helps a little bit, though, if it transitions from like a sunny conditions to a little bit of a cloudy condition, or some sort of subtle change to the weather does help that bite. But that's kind of the deal with that big flutter spoon, and it's a really crazy pattern, because I'll go on areas around the lake where I know big schools of fish are set up, like let's say late summertime. I know they've been pounded, they're in community holes. I'll go right behind anglers, and the boat will literally leave. I'll pull in right behind them 5 minutes later, throw that big Magnum flutter spoon out there and rip it for like 15 minutes, 10 minutes, and I get one big fish to fire, then I'll catch like 15 fish off that spot, and I trigger them with that big bait. What are your thoughts there, Randy?
Well, first of all, I don't own any big spoons, so what you just said there is probably not applicable to my way of fishing. And Johnny has been trying to get me to do this fish the moment challenge on big spoons, and it's probably going to be pretty embarrassing to me when we do that, because it's sort of hard to catch them on that thing out of 3 foot of water. But I'm going to show you guys sort of my opposite from what Jonny was talking about. You know, he's talking about, you know, triggering up those bigger fish from deeper water with those giant baits. When I think about oversized baits, I'm talking about baits I can see for the most part coming through the water. And for in my situation, it would be these two right here. This is the Magdraft 262T glide bait and the Megabass Magdraft 10-inch model on here. These are giant baits, guys. Here's a 6-inch Magdraft. This is a big bait. The 6-inch Magdraft is considered a big bait, but holding it up next to the 10-inch Magdraft, it looks like a little finesse model. It's absolutely small. So anyway, what I'm looking for in this type of a deal is anytime that I'm throwing these big giant ones, and I want to start with this because when I'm thinking about big baits, I go big. I mean, I throw the biggest ones in there. I've had talks with Oliver and I about this in detail, and Oliver's the same way. These are the two main baits that Oliver throws all the time. I mean, that's his favorite models. I mean, he's got access to every big one out there, and these are the two that they have. And what you're looking for on this is you're looking for those areas that you can pull big fish up or away from cover. So when I'm fishing these particular type of baits here, I'm keeping them I try to keep them in sight as much as I can, or just barely out of sight. I prefer to keep them in sight, and I'm fishing them around obvious areas that produce big fish. We're talking about main lake points, secondary points, you know, off the corners of boat docks, bridge piers, channel swing banks, on bluff bank channel swings, these type of areas where you have bass that are positioned that will come up on a bait. Because the key on these big baits, the bigger that you go, the less that you can have the bass get a good look at them. If they get a chance to have a good look at this bait and study it, that's when they won't bite it. So when you're talking about fishing an area, and it could be like a point that, you know, you're throwing your bait over 10 foot of water, depending upon the water visibility, you want those fish to have to come for a distance to get this bait, get close to it, and make that commitment before they study it too much. One of the biggest mistakes that I see guys make when they're fishing big glide baits or big swim baits, like the 10-inch Magdraft, is when they see a bass follow this thing, they tend to, like, you know, either slow it down or try to stop it or that type of stuff. When you see a bass following one of these things, you have to start ripping this thing in. You just have to start jerking it hard, ripping it hard. And by doing that, it forces the bass to either commit to the bait or not commit to the bait. And that's how you trigger those followers. It doesn't work all the time, but it works a lot of times. Another thing about the big glide baits, here's actually the two that I use. This is the Megabass iSlide 185 versus the 262T. This 185 is still a big bait, and this is the one I use most of the time when I'm fishing glide baits. But when you're fishing these baits here, they have a natural swimming action just like that. They come back, and a lot of people fish them like that. You see them, they throw them out there, keep the rod tip pointed at the bait, and they just let it go like this. And you can catch some fish like that. But one of the big secrets that I'll share with you that I actually learned from Oliver is you want to fish these big glide baits like a jerk bait. I throw them out there on a big, heavy 8-foot rod, 25-pound test fluorocarbon line, and I rip it just like a jerk bait, and it darts it back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And then you can stop it. You know, the things are real slow floaters, but to me, by jerking that bait hard, fishing it fast and hard, it doesn't give the bass a chance to study that bait very much. And again, a lot of this has to do with the water clarity that you're fishing. The big glide baits and the big swim baits like that, they'll work in a variety of water clarities. Once you start getting into water clarities that are sort of like under that 2-foot visibility, then they don't work that good. For me, I'm looking for water visibilities between like 3 to 6 feet. I think that that's the optimum water clarity. I think that most every lake out there that has a good big bait bite on it has those same type of water clarities on there, because that's the clarity that it gives them that ability to come for that bait from a long way. Another thing about these baits, guys, you have to realize is you need to fish them if you have lakes that have big fish in them. If you're fishing lakes like in Ohio, like Lake Patoka or the Ohio River, that doesn't have many big fish in it, you're pretty much wasting your time in it. You got to have a lake that is sort of known to have quality bass in it. Not that a small one will hit it, but the lakes that are known to have quality fishing, quality bass are the lakes where these big swim baits work the best.
And with that bait, Randy, do you feel like you're imitating like a big gizzard shad, a bluegill? What type of forage are you imitating there? Or are they just curious about the big bait and they just don't really care what it is?
Well, I think that like the 262T is definitely a gizzard shad bait. But here's another one. This is the Megabass Battalion, and this is basically a bluegill or a perch imitator. I mean, this is the same deal. It's a glide bait just like the 262T, but it's a completely different profile. So if the bass are feeding on yellow perch or bluegill, something like that, then you have to have a different bait profile. I mean, there's so many out there. I mean, I think Tackle Warehouse has got a huge swim bait category line, don't they? They got everything you can imagine on there.
Yep.
So it probably depends on the forage that you're fishing. But to me, bass are opportunistic. A lot of people tend to get keyed in on, like they say, oh, I need to have a goby imitator because I'm going to the Great Lakes, that type of thing. And that's not necessarily the key. I mean, bass are opportunistic. They'll bite bait fish type colors that don't even exist in their lakes.
Got it. Good deal. Well, sticking with the swim bait stuff, one thing that I throw a lot are these bigger, well, they're not that big compared to the 262, but I got Megabass Magdraft Freestyle here on Underspin. If you guys watch my live scope video, I was crushing some fish that were feeding on gizzard shad, 4, 5, 6 pounders. This bait is completely torn up from that trip. And you can catch a lot of big fish suspended, especially if you have big gizzard shad or even like big threadfin shad. This bait will work. You just need a 4, 5, or 6 inch bait fish, probably 5 to 6 inch bait fish, and this bait will be good. My rule of thumb is when you have really big shad in your lake, you want to match the biggest shad that you can get away with. So like this, basically this Magdraft Freestyle is the biggest swim bait I can really get away with and throw. I do throw a 7-inch bass trick swim bait as well, but it's not that much bigger than this, so I basically just stick with this one. But if you can get away with a little bit bigger bait, like for example, this is the Jenko Fishing Tremor Shad, and it's a scrounger head style bait, but it's a 7-inch fluke style bait, and it just gives off a big profile, and that's really what I'm looking for, guys. This with the head is basically a 7-inch profile on this bait. This is about an 8-inch profile on this bait. It's just imitating those big gizzard shad, and I'll throw these kind of in the same areas. I'll throw those flutter spoons, though I find the flutter spoons usually generate a few more really good bites, but sometimes that tremor shad will trigger the fish when the flutter spoon won't. And then also when you get more into the colder months, like let's say water temperature is below 70 degrees, that's when the big 6-inch Magdraft Freestyle on a big 1-ounce underspin is a great wintertime bait for those big fish offshore. Now, another bait category that I'm going to talk about is not necessarily a big bait, Randy, but it's a bait that requires the same amount of commitment to catch really big fish, and that is a buzz bait with a toad trailer. This is a War Eagle buzz toad buzz bait with a black horny toad on the back. And this is a big fish catching machine. It will catch a lot of 1.5 to 2 pound bass, but also catches a lot of 5, 6, and 7 pound bass. And this is a bait that I throw in the summertime. And if you had to pick one bait, if I had to pick one bait to go up shallow and just throw all day to try to get 5 big bites, this buzz bait would be the bait for me. And I have had some really good days, especially like on the Arkansas River, muddier water, let's say 1 to 2 foot of water visibility, up shallow, where I can go up, and I'll kind of share my screen to kind of give you an idea. I'll go up and I'll throw this buzz bait literally all day. So if I pull up this Google Earth, I'll show you some of the spots, some areas where I've caught them. One place I'll go is like on the Arkansas River down here, where basically I'll just get on the main river channel, and a lot of guys are throwing spinner baits, a lot of guys are throwing crank baits, flipping a swim jig, stuff like that, and I'll get on bank grass here, I'll get on shallow jetties, rock jetties on these river systems all summer long, like now basically through October, November. And if I just want to go get 3, 4 big bites a day, maybe I have like a pattern where I can catch a few smaller fish early on a swim jig or something, then I'll just pick up that buzzbait the rest of the day. And I'm only going to get maybe 3 or 4 bites on that bait. But if I can get those fish in the boat, which normally you do with those bigger fish, you can crush the field. And I'll go in some backwaters even. I kind of just throw a little bit of everywhere. And if you have dirtier water in the summer, you can catch them up shallow on that buzzbait. Another lake that caught some really big fish on in videos before is this little lake right here, Lake Atkins. It looks very clear in this image, but a lot of times it's pretty stained up. And I've gone through on this lake in the past, and just there's a bunch of cypress trees around this lake, and there's a bunch of shallow fish that just kind of get in trees and stuff. And I'll go in July in the middle of the summer and just, it has dirty water, and I'll just pick up a buzzbait and just fish all day long. And a lot of the fish that feed on that buzzbait are actually feeding on bigger bluegill. And you're not going to, again, get a ton of bites doing this, but if you get 5 in the boat doing it, you're going to do really, really well. This also works even, guys, on some of the lakes over on the East Coast. If you ever watched any of the FLW tour events or FLW Forestwood Cups, the old Forestwood Cup, rest in peace, back in the day, if you went to like a Lake Murray or if you went to some of these lakes where they have the blueback herring in them, a lot of you guys will chase brimbed bass with that buzzbait in the middle of the summer in clear water lakes and just burn shallow water with that buzzbait. Not a numbers deal, but if I had to pick one way to catch fish in the summertime, Randy, up shallow, give me a buzzbait. I'll just throw it all day. And basically with it, guys, you just need to throw it for 8 hours straight on any sort of cover, shade, anything that casts a shadow, and you might get an hour window, just like with the big swim baits, where you'll get 3 or 4 bites, boom, 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 or you'll get into a little pocket that has a group of fish, and you'll catch 2 or 3 off one stretch of boat docks or one stretch of shallow grass. But it's just one of those baits you have to commit to, and if you want to get big bites, it is an absolutely great way to catch them. I just don't think a lot of guys want to put that bait in their hand all day, like we've talked about. They'll put this buzzbait in their hand for an hour in the morning. First hour of the morning, they'll stop throwing it. I get my biggest bites on this buzzbait, Randy, in the middle of the day, in the bright bluebird skies, no wind, and I'll catch them at like 2 in the afternoon on this buzzbait. And I just throw it and throw it and throw it, and I won't put it down. I'll put one bait in the deck of my boat all day long and just throw it. And I've had some great days over the years doing that. It's just a confidence deal for me. But again, it's a 5 to 7 bites a day sort of deal. All the things we're talking about, guys, you're not going to get 20 bites a day on a glide bait, 20 bites a day on this big flutter spoon, unless you're on like a mega school of fish that's like fresh, that you could catch them on anything at that point. Like if they're biting this and you're catching 20 fish, you can probably catch them on a regular spoon, just like a drop shot, a football jig, whatever. But if you really want to get these big baits to work, you have to just commit all day.
Yeah, I think that, one of the things that I was wanting to discuss here, I think that probably as important as the baits themselves is you have to have the mental shift that we're talking about to throw the big baits. Because the first thing you have to have is a commitment to do so. If you don't have the commitment to throw these things all day, you're simply not going to catch many fish on them. Simply because you're not going to get that many bites on them. If you try them for an hour or two and don't get bit on them, you're probably going to lose confidence in these type of baits and quit throwing them. The best advice I can give everybody is if they want to catch bass on these big baits we're talking about, do not take anything else with you out there. Mm-hmm. Simply take just a handful of these baits. It forces you to fish them all day long, and you can spend your time looking for the water that those fish work, that those baits work in, because that's the whole key. That's the big puzzle that you have to put together, is you have to put yourself in the water that can generate those type of strikes from those baits. And if you don't have any other options, you're simply forced to hunt that water out all the time. And exactly. That's a prime example of what happened to Jonny and I yesterday at Table Rock Lake. I guarantee if him and I were in a tournament together, after the first hour, we would have put those big baits down and we would have picked up everything else trying to catch 5 fish. But I can promise you, by the end of the day, those 5 fish we caught on traditional techniques wouldn't have weighed what we eventually caught, on the big baits. So it requires that type of a mental shift. Another thing about that is you got to have the right gear for these baits. It doesn't matter what you're throwing. You can't go out and throw them on your traditional tackle. Most of the time, if you're serious about it, you have to have a bigger level wind reel on it, something that holds a little bit higher capacity of heavier line. You got to have a rod that is heavier than a flipping stick. If you take this 10-inch mag draft right here, or the iSlide, either one, and I can put it on my 7-foot 11-inch Alcalys Megabass flipping stick, which is a stiff flipping stick. It feels like the rod's going to break in half when I throw this 262T on it. This bait weighs 6 ounces. So you got to have a rod that is super heavy with a long handle on it that you can make those long casts with it. On top of that, you have to fish every cast. You have to be present every cast. You have to be visualizing that strike every time, because if you don't, you're going to get surprised by it. To me, it's like the biggest hurdle overcoming this is simply the mental part of throwing it all day long. And we're not conditioned to do that. I mean, this is something that is foreign to everybody out there that hasn't done it. I have not spent as much time as some guys have. I mean, a lot of the guys that really got good at these were the California guys that got on this bite 20 years ago on Clear Lake. There were several California lakes out there where they started catching them on that big 10 and 12-inch Huddleston swim bait. They were catching giants on it. There was 15 and 20 pounders caught on it. And it stayed in California for a lot of years until a handful of guys, there was like Skeet Reese, Steve Kennedy, some of those guys brought it back east. But I can remember the first time that it came out. I was fishing the Toyota Texas Bass Classic on Lake Fork. This was back 20-some years ago. And this was back before big swim baits existed. And that's back when, if you guys remember the Bastrix swim bait, that was the first one that came out. Nobody knew about the Bastrix swim bait, which was a big bait in that Toyota Texas Bass Classic. But I just happened to have Luke Clausen it was a team event there, and Luke and I were on the team together. So him and I were teamed up, and he knew about a guy that had some of these Bastrix swim baits from a California tournament. We had a few of them and just wrecked them out there. It actually started at that tournament, and then it blew up, and people started taking the bigger baits, and it got bigger and bigger and bigger. Some of the Japanese companies started coming out with the big baits. Some of the custom lure manufacturers came out with the big baits, and it still is a niche bait. I mean, even as successful as they are, you don't have a big percentage of the bass fishing population that fish them. One of the things I'd suggest for you guys to go over to Oliver Nye's YouTube page. He's got more videos on big bait fishing than anybody out there. And if you guys are serious about it and you want to learn, go check out some of Oliver's videos, because it shows cast to catch on all these baits I'm talking about, the 262, the 10-inch mag draft, all these other big baits out there. And once you see it, and once you see Oliver swinging over 9-pounders over the side of the boat with the saltwater tackle, you'll want to go out and throw it all day too.
Yeah, but he also doesn't show the 4 days in a row where he doesn't catch a single fish. So don't think that you're going to go out there and catch a 9-pounder first time. That's one thing you got to be okay with, guys, when you're fishing these techniques. You're going to have more days than not that you're not going to find that perfect window, that perfect combination. You have to be okay not catching fish when you go do this. That's one thing that I feel like a lot of guys mess up on, is you need to spend all 8 hours doing this, but you also have to be okay with the fact that maybe you don't find them in those 8 hours, and you have to do this 2 or 3 times to start dialing in where and when to throw these baits. Randy and I have been doing this for a while, so we know in general where we should be throwing these baits, areas, the types of structure, cover, the weather conditions we need. So not only do we know how to throw the baits, but we know where to fish them. If you don't know where to fish them, the conditions to fish them in, all those factors, plus you have no confidence in the bait, it might take you 2 or 3 fishing trips to get it dialed in. A guy like Oliver Nye, that's all he does. He does it for a living. He throws big baits every single day. So he's going to have a lot better chance of catching those fish because he has, 1, more confidence, 2, he knows where the fish are. So don't get discouraged if you try it for a day. But one thing I do want to talk about, guys, is a little bit about some baits that maybe are not as jumbo as like an 8-inch flutter spoon, but they're still big baits that will catch some better than average fish. But before we do that, I do want to talk about one thing really quick, and we're just going to pull this up. I just want to let you guys know about an upcoming virtual seminar that we have going on over on fishthemoment.com. So you guys know we don't have any sponsors or anything for this live stream. We just provide this free to you guys, and the way that we support all of our content is through our website, fishthemoment.com. So if you head to the website and then head to the virtual seminars page, you'll see an upcoming seminar that Randy and I are going to be doing about advanced summer jig fishing. And you guys may be wondering what these seminars are all about, and you may be kind of wondering what we do in these seminars, how it all works. Well, basically, let me just show you one of the graphics from our upcoming seminar that we kind of talk about and how we set up the seminar. Basically, what we like to do is give you guys a very detailed summary of all these patterns. We start by giving you a summary slide like the one you see here. This is going to be coming up from the actual seminar. Our patterns, the key baits, key structures, cover, water clarity. And then once we give you the summary, we're going to deep dive into every single element. We're going to explain why water clarity or why water level matters. Exactly what we mean by a flat bank on a variety of lakes across the country. Talking in depth about water clarity, water temperature, talking about all different types of cover, showing you multiple examples of everything so you can translate it to your lake, as well as our bait modifications to improve your chances of catching fish, and a lot more information. And this is just one of usually 7 to 10 patterns that we'll show, and we'll have a combination of offshore and shallow patterns. So if you guys are interested in getting this information, again, you get these slides that we create and we send them to you so you can even take them to the lake with you. So if you guys do like the look of them, some of that content, you can head over to the fishthemoment.com website, sign up for our advanced summer jig fishing seminar. We put a ton of time into these seminars, and if we go here, you can see, just click sign up. We currently have 6 spots left, so that's all we got left in this seminar. So definitely sign up. It's going to be this Thursday. Sign up before it's gone. If you're fishing this summer and want to catch some big fish, jigs are definitely a great way to do it. So let me pull this down. Appreciate all the support on that, guys, as well. Oh, by the way, really quick, I do want to, let me pull this back up. Sorry. One thing I do want to let you guys know about is that we do have some of our past seminar recordings too. So for example, our pre-spawn tournament patterns, how weather affects bass, offshore summer secrets, a lot of other information that's great. We can't go into all the detail in these streams, guys, just because it's hard to do it without all the graphics and things, but we have a really highly polished presentation for all these seminars. Some of the guys in the live stream can definitely attest. We got Timo says seminars are worth he just says every. So hopefully every dollar. I don't know if that works, but Chris says the classes are excellent, guys. Learned a lot in the advanced electronics session. So appreciate those comments. But anyways, let's jump back to some stuff on actual applications of these big baits. So one thing that I find, guys, is that with a big bait, we're talking about these bigger baits, but we also want to talk about how to catch more 4+ pound bass. One thing that I've found that's very, very helpful in catching bigger fish overall when you're trying to go in these areas is picking a bait that is a little bit bigger than what everyone else is throwing and a little bit different. So to give you an example of this, here is my go-to jerkbait that I was fishing this spring over offshore brush piles for the pre-spawn bass. Megabass Vision 110 +1. Dives about 7 to 9 feet deep on a good cast. And this is a really, really solid bait. Caught a ton of big fish on this bait. What I found, though, is that as the spring progressed, a lot of guys were throwing this bait as well. And what I went to later in the year was a little bit bigger bait. This is the Smithwick Perfect 10 Rogue. Now, it doesn't seem like it's that much bigger. It's just, it's slightly bigger than that Vision 110. It's about almost about a full inch bigger in general, but that Perfect 10 Rogue dives about the exact same depth. I can actually get a little bit deeper so I can throw a little bit heavier line. And I was throwing this in the same areas I was throwing this Vision 110 +1, and I actually ended up catching my personal best bass, a 10.5 pounder on this bait. The cast before, I caught a 5 pounder off the same brush pile, caught 2 more fish over 4 pounds on this bait, and I had been throwing this Vision 110 standard and just couldn't get those fish to commit. They weren't biting it. Went to the bigger bait, got them to bite. Again, this is a slight increase in size. This isn't going from a massive or from a tiny bait to a massive bait. It's a small difference in the size of that bait. and probably just fewer guys throw this Vision 1 or this Perfect 10 Rogue. So that's just one example to go to show you guys that if you feel like you're around big fish, upgrading your bait by an inch over what you're currently throwing, sometimes that can make all the difference and can really put more fish in the boat. Another thing I do a lot, if we go over here, here's my the Jewel Bait Versacraw I designed for Jewel Bait Company. And with this bait, what you can see is you have this smaller Versacraw. This is the junior size, and I pair that on the back of a football jig, and I got one right here. It looks really, really nice. It's got a nice profile on the back of that football jig. Fits it really, really well. But what I can do if I want to generate bigger bites, I might get 15 bites a day on this football jig. What I can do is take off that smaller Versacraw and go to the bigger Versacraw, the senior size. We don't have it out quite yet. We're going to be putting it out here pretty soon. I'll let you guys know when it's launching. But go into that little bit bigger bait, about an inch longer and having a little bit wider profile. And I'll also leave the skirt a little bit longer. That 1 inch difference in profile will decrease the number of bites you get, but increase the quality of the bites you get, usually by about 1 pound to 1.5 pounds. So I will do that a lot of times if I feel like I don't want to go out and get numbers of bites, or if I feel like a lot of guys in my area are throwing a lot of those baits. I'll go to that big profile and go bigger as opposed to going smaller. A lot of times too, if I'm not getting bit on that smaller jig, or the standard size jig, before I go to like a little shaky head, I'll actually go to a bigger bait first, because I find that bigger bait will trigger those bigger fish into biting. Again, I'm not going to get the number of bites, but it will trigger fish that other guys aren't getting to bite. So that's just something that I've done, guys, that I feel like is really important. Going a little bit bigger with your bait profile, not going all the way to this massive 8-inch bait, and you can get a lot of good bites. What are your thoughts there, Randy?
Yeah, that's probably a more realistic approach. If you fish, I'll talk about a handful of baits here. The old adage is like, big fish and big baits catch big fish is extremely true. Now you can catch big fish on any bait out there. In fact, the lake record, or the old lake record, it was broken on Alabama rig at Grand Lake a couple years ago. But the old lake record of 11 pounds and something at Grand Lake was caught by some dude was crappie fishing off of the Elk River riprap, and he caught an 11.5 pounder on a crappie jig. So you can catch giants on anything, but your odds go up tremendously if you fish those lures that produce big fish. In general, the lure categories that produce the bigger fish are going to be your jigs, like your full size jigs, football head jigs, like what Johnny's talking about, that with the offshore jig he has. Big spinner baits is going to be a big key on there. Jerk baits, big deep diving crankbaits, top waters, and swim baits. Those categories out there, if you want to catch 4 pound plus bass, you have to stay in those categories. You can, if you're up north or something, you're going to catch 4 pounders on a drop shot. You're going to catch a lot of 4 pound smallmouth on a drop shot, but that's a rarity. Most of the time when you're using those smaller baits, like the smaller crankbaits, even the medium-sized crankbaits, Texas rig worms, creature baits, any of that type of category, your odds of catching big ones are still there, but they go way down unless you just stay with those bait profiles. I'm going to guess, as far as the time that I've fished over the last 50 years, the amount of time that I have fished every single lure category versus the amount of 4 pound plus bass that I've caught, in my opinion, a big spinnerbait is the most efficient way to catch big fish. It produces big ones, it produces quality bass, and you can still get numbers on it. I bet that I've caught more big bass, when I'm talking about big ones, like 7 pound plus fish on like a big spinnerbait with a big blade on it, Colorado or Willow, either one, slow rolling it. It's a big bait, it goes slow, it moves a lot of water, has a lot of vibration. So that's the whole thing about it. If you want to catch 4 pound plus fish those baits that produce big ones.
Yeah, and this is one of the spinnerbaits I throw. It doesn't look that different from a normal spinnerbait, but this is a 1 ounce Booyah Covert series spinnerbait with a size 6 willow leaf. And I've actually gone up to a size 7 willow leaf at times. That's a really big blade. The standard size, if you buy a spinnerbait out of the package, your standard half-ounce spinnerbait has a 4.5 size blade. So this is a size 6, a lot bigger blade. I've gone to a size 7 before to catch some fish. This is what Randy's talking about. You need that heavier head, that 1 ounce, 3/4 ounce to 1 ounce head, because this blade is going to kick up a lot more vibration and a lot more lift. So you need a heavier head to keep that bait down the strike zone. But that is kind of the spinnerbait profile that we're talking about, big spinnerbait. Here's a Strike King 10XD crankbait, catches a lot of big fish. I've caught a lot of big fish on this exact one here. One thing to call out, though, is that these big baits, Randy, they're not always the best choice when you're fishing in a tournament. So I know that a lot of times in tournaments, there's so much fishing pressure around that unless you get those ideal conditions, the wind, the cloud cover going, and everyone's catching them, if everyone is catching fish and the fish are super aggressive, going to a big bait is great because you're going to get bigger bites than your competition. But if the bite is really tough and there's a lot of fishing pressure, going to a big bait is usually not going to be your best option. Can you kind of give us some insight there?
Well, I'll use a prime example. A lot of you guys know who Elite Series Pro Carl Jacobson is. Is it Jacobson or Jacobson?
I think.
Jacobson.
Oh, yeah.
Carl loves to fish a big glide bait, and he's had a lot of success doing it. But if you notice it, there's been like a half a dozen Elite Series tournaments where he's like been leading the first day of the tournament with a 20-pound plus bag on a big glide bait, and then the next day he catches one on it. So that's what you're looking at it. It's like, to me, the big baits out there are supplemental. I try to approach it from a realistic point of view. Some guys out there, Steve Kennedy, Carl, I've seen Skeet Reese do it a little bit. So there's a handful of guys out there that can pick these baits up, throw them all day long in a tournament situation. But for me, the only time I really throw them is if I get what I feel is in that window, or I've got a good limit of fish and I'm trying for a kicker in there. But it's highly situational. And that's one thing that you're going to find about the big bait categories. It doesn't matter if it's spinnerbait, jigs, crankbaits, topwaters, whatever. The more time that you have on the water and the more dirt time that you have fishing, the more that you know when to automatically pick up that bait and throw it. So there's actually two different schools of thought there. There's the school of thought that I just told you there. And then there's the other school of thought that if you just throw it all day long, that you're going to put yourself in position to win. And I'll use an example here again with the 262 glide bait. 3 years ago, there was they had a big bass bash at Lake of the Ozarks, and Oliver and I fished it with a friend of mine. It was a team deal, and they won the tournament. They won $100,000 on the 262T glide bait at Lake of the Ozarks. And Oliver told me he practiced for that tournament for 2 days, threw nothing but the glide bait for 2 days. And then the 2-day tournament, it was a 2-day tournament. Both of them did nothing but throw the 262 for 2 solid days, never put it down. They had 4 bites in 2 days, and 4 bites actually in 4 days, 2 days practice and 2 days tournament. A 6.8 pounder, which won the tournament. They lost one about 7, he said, and they had a 4 pounder and a 3 pounder. So look how many hours that is. That's a total of 16. That's 32 hours of fishing. Probably, I'm going to guess, well over 10,000 casts for 4 bites. But he won $100,000 doing it. So it's all about, what your goals and expectations are as far as how much you should or shouldn't adopt this.
And for some guys, that might be really cool. But for other guys who get to fish 1 day a week or maybe 1 day a month, committing to that, especially like Oliver, again, he's an expert at that. So we shouldn't take the fact that he was able to get 4 bites in 4 days and he's an expert. That just goes to show you might get 1 bite in 4 days. You have to keep that in mind. But if you do want to figure out how to get these fish to bite these baits and when to use them, our recommendation by far is to just find one of these baits you want to throw. Let's say you want to catch them on an 8-inch flutter spoon offshore. You probably want to buy a couple of these things if you're going to throw them all day because you will hang them and lose them, and they're not cheap. But let's say you want to do it. Go buy a bunch of them and just throw it all day long and figure out when they're going to bite it. That's what I've done with these baits. All these baits we're talking about, guys, I've had to just go out over the years, take one of these baits and go, and I probably spent like a 10XD. When I first got my hands on this, I spent 6 days on the water just throwing the 6XD to finally figure out when, where, and how to get these fish to bite. I need to know what type of cover, what type of drops, how big the schools of fish need to be, all these different things. So now that I've taken that time to build that knowledge, I now have it tied onto my boat, and if I ever get a situation that calls for it, I'll pull it out of the box, make 10 to 15 casts with it, and maybe I'll fish it for an hour even, and see if I can get him to go on it. And it can be great when it happens, just like our day on Table Rock. But a lot of times it's not that easy. And you shouldn't ever pick up a bait like this, guys, like a big swim bait or something like that, going out and banking on your day of catching fish on this type of bait. That was almost like a fool's errand for us, Randy, when we went out yesterday. I was like, oh, that was a bad decision. Because, like, I had a school of fish, Randy, that was these school of spotted bass. And I was throwing a bait similar to this out there. And I had so many fish. I was watching them on my live scope. They were hitting it, getting it all over it, and I was just so frustrated because they were big spotted bass. I had 2 of them jump off halfway to the boat. If I had been throwing like a 4-inch swim bait or a 3-inch swim bait, I would have probably caught 15 fish for like 13-pound limit. But because I committed to that, nothing worked out. But then later in the day, I kept throwing it, and I started getting better quality fish even than that. But they were largemouth up shallow. So if I could have mixed those together and said, okay, I knew that I should throw the smaller swim bait on these offshore fish in the first 6 hours, I could have a 13-pound limit. Then in the feeding window, if I would know to put the small swim bait down, pick up the other bait, start throwing it, boom, now you start catching more fish and you can kind of upgrade. So that's kind of the way you have to think about it, guys. It's not usually the best idea to if you're going out with your goal of catching as many fish as possible and having a fun day, that's not usually the objective of these big baits. It's usually, they're very situational. You should throw them when they're working, but if you want to learn how to throw them, you just have to force yourself to have some bad days with them. Would you agree there, Randy?
Yeah, no doubt. And knowing when to throw them is another big key as far as time of the year. And this varies geographically and also with the bait that you're using. I'll sort of give you guys a foundation of how you can sort of begin a search with it. When you're talking about the big swim baits and the big glide baits, you're going to find out that they work best from the late pre-spawn into the early post-spawn. Most parts of the country, it's usually a bite window of like between March to June, that type of deal. That's when those big glide baits and swim baits work good. And then there's also a sort of a mid to late fall window when the glide baits work good in the late fall. So that's one category there. If you're throwing the big giant deep diving crankbaits like the 10XD like Johnny's talking about, or the here's one of my favorites, this Megabass Big M 4.5, these giant crankbaits, you're going to find that the post spawn period is going to be the best time for those big giant crankbaits. Those fish, when they get done spawning and they move out to those secondary main points and the ledges, that's the time of year that those big giant crankbaits shine. They don't work as good a little bit later in the summer. We're right in that window right now. We're getting into it. It's like right now we're just starting to get in that big crankbait window. The big giant worms, we haven't really talked about that much tonight, but there's a lot of like 12, 15-inch plastic worms. I use a 12-inch Zoom Magnum 10-inch or 12-inch worm quite a bit. The old Monster Magnum. In the middle of the summer when it's really hot, that's when you're going to find those big worms that work really good. Same with what Johnny said with the buzz baits and the topwaters. And then, then you're going to have situational stuff that produce big bass, like punching mats, anywhere you have vegetation, maybe some Magnum jerk baits for smallmouth up north. There's always situational things based upon the water trend. So one of the things that's going to add up for more consistency for you all is if you find out when those baits work on the specific body of water that you're fishing around your home.
For sure. They're saying they're coming for you, by the way, Randy, with the sirens in the background. I don't know if you need to cut off the stream early, take shelter, let us know. Oh, man. They're coming after you for all your hot takes on YouTube. They're like, he's being too controversial. Got to get him off. He doesn't like bananas in his boat. We're coming for him. Cuff him. Put a banana in the back seat.
Oh, man. Hey, that's a serious deal to some guys. I bet there's some guys out there after that video today that's thinking, man, he didn't know what he's talking about. Those things are bad luck.
It's awesome. Well, guys, one thing really quick here. I just wanted to remind you guys about the upcoming virtual seminar over here on fishthemoment.com. Just head to our website, fishthemoment.com. And if you guys want to help support this free content we do here, also on the main Fish the Moment channel, check out this live seminar. This is our Advanced Summer Jig Fishing Seminar. Randy and I are going to be talking about the best shallow and offshore jig patterns. And if we take a look here, I'll show you guys a teaser slide from one of the PowerPoint slides we put together for you. You get all of these slides in a packet afterwards. This is just our high-level summary. We then dive really deep using contour maps, using aerial footage. We talk about bait modifications, everything. So you guys have everything you need to know to catch fish on a jig in the summertime, both offshore and shallow. We're going to be covering lakes all across the country, making sure that we know we get lakes of your type covered so that you can apply all this information. It's the most detailed information you're going to find on a specific technique anywhere on the internet, anywhere you'll find, and we put a ton of time putting all this content together for you, so definitely check those out. We put a lot of effort into it, and so hopefully you guys will enjoy. I know some of you guys have already signed up for seminars, so definitely check that out. I think there's like 6 spots left, so sign up before it's out. That's this Thursday over at fishthemoment.com. So Randy, basically let's tie a bow on this topic for tonight. In general, when you're fishing these big baits, what would be your number one takeaway or number one tip for guys tonight? What's your number one thing that you would say for these big baits?
Number one, without a doubt, Johnny, is that you have to mentally get it in your mind that you have to commit to throwing this thing all day long. Until you get that mentality, you'll never experience what it's like to catch big fish on a big bait. And it's fun, guys. I'm telling you, when you have those big 5-pound plus fish come out and just clobber those big baits like that, it's addictive. And if you want to experience that, you just put everything away. Don't even put it in your rod locker. Put 2 rods out on the deck with 2 big baits on it, and just go hunt the water that you think those things are going to work in. The people that do that are the guys that catch fish on these things. Everybody else just listens and reads about people that catch fish on them.
For sure. The other thing, guys, my number one tip is if you're going to go offshore and start throwing some of these big 8-inch Flutter spoons, it's crazy, that 6-inch mag draft with the head, it's 7 inches long, it looks tiny compared to that big Flutter spoon. But if you're going to throw a big bait like this, guys, know the forage in your lake. When I'm catching fish on this big swim bait or the big Flutter spoon, there need to be big gizzard shad in the lake. I'm talking about 6, 7, 8, 9-inch gizzard shad, 10-inch gizzard shad. That's what those bass are feeding on, and that's what these baits are imitating. If you're offshore trying to throw a giant bait, you need to have the forage available to make those fish, react. If you're fishing on lakes where you don't have the big gizzard shad, maybe a better option then is to go to a really big football jig with like a big trailer on it, so you have a lot of bulk to that bait. A big football jig with a big trailer will imitate a bluegill really well. Or if you're fishing up north, find out how big the perch get. Maybe your perch get 6 inches long, 5 inches long. Pick up a big jerk bait or maybe a bigger swim bait that imitates those perch. But you want to make sure that your bait is matching the largest forage you have. But you need to know what the forage is. If it's bluegill, if it's big gizzard shad, if it's perch, match the size of your bait should match the biggest forage that you know your bass are feeding on. That's my number one tip. And that will kind of help you avoid some wasted time trying to throw a big 8-inch Flutter spoon on a northern lake where the biggest forage is a 4-inch perch. So that is my number one tip there. So anyways, Randy, that is it for tonight. Any last comments before we wrap it up?
Yeah, thanks again for joining in, guys. Much appreciated. I know it's getting into summer and it's getting daylight later at night, so you guys probably want to do other stuff besides sitting here and watching YouTube, but we appreciate all the hardcore fan base out there. Johnny and I are just very grateful you guys tune in every week. So hopefully we'll see you all next Tuesday.
Yeah, we'll be back next Tuesday, guys, with another great topic. Stay tuned on the Fish the Moment Live channel. We're starting to do these quick cuts where we're actually cutting up the live streams because we know they're a long block of content. So check back every single day on this channel, the Fish the Moment Live channel, where you can get the super cuts. And I basically take the best clips from all the live streams and post them so that you can get a really solid, 8 to 10 minute video that you can watch. So you don't have to try to consume a full hour of the live stream. I'll just take the highlights basically and put them on this channel. So subscribe to this Fish the Moment Live channel. Leave a like on the video if you're still here. That really helps us out. And also make sure to check out our videos on the main Fish the Moment channel. If you somehow made it here and you are only watching these live streams in this channel, know that this is the Fish the Moment live stream channel. We have a whole other YouTube channel, the main Fish the Moment channel, where we do our highly edited videos. We spend 30 to 40 hours producing every single video over there. A lot of graphics, drone shots, fish catches, actually us fishing, all that stuff. So check out those videos on the main Fish the Moment channel. Just type in Fish the Moment. It'll pop up. It'll be the first thing that pops up on YouTube or Google or anything like that. So anyways, thanks again for checking out the live stream, guys. We'll see you next Tuesday. Have a great night.